Wednesday, May 18th, 2008. Brandon Swanson, a freshman at the Minnesota West Community College in Canby, was heading south on Highway 68 to get back to his home in Marshall, Minnesota. His semester had just ended, and he had been out celebrating with his friends. But around midnight, Brandon had decided he had enough for the night, and decided to start heading home. However, that night, instead of taking Highway 68 directly to Marshall from Canby, he decided to go off the highway and instead use the side gravel roads. Around 1:54 a.m., he would veer off the road and drive his car into a ditch. Realizing that he couldn't free his car, he would call his parents in Marshall and ask them to drive over and pick him up. Not fully sure where he was, he would notice some lights in the distance, particularly a bright red light, believing that the lights were the town of Lind, which was 11 kilometers southwest of Marshall. His parents would immediately make their way towards Lind. However, they would have trouble finding their son. Brandon would begin to flash his lights, and so would his parents, but neither would notice the other. Becoming frustrated, Brandon would tell his father that he would walk towards Lind, and for his father to meet him at a local bar in the town. He would initially walk alongside the road, but eventually decided to cut through a field. His father would remain on the phone and Brandon would continue to speak to him. However, soon after crossing into the field, Brandon would yell, "Oh shit," and then silence. His parents were still on the line and would desperately try to get the attention of their son. Eventually, they would end the call and try to call back, but there would be no answer. His father would reach Lind and wait for his son to arrive, but Brandon would never make it to Lind. In fact, he wouldn't make it anywhere. His parents didn't know it yet, but they just witnessed what would go down as one of the most mysterious disappearances in American history. "19-year-old Brandon Swanson was a native of Marshall, Minnesota, and had been born to Annette and Brian Swanson. He was of average build but was legally blind in his left eye. He had recently graduated from Marshall High School in 2007 and decided to attend the Minnesota West Community and Technical College to study wind energy in nearby Canby. The school was conveniently located as Canby was only 48 kilometers away, and Brandon could easily drive between the campus and his home. May 17th of 2008 had been the last day of school. With all assignments and exams complete, Brandon had decided to spend the day celebrating with friends. Driving his green Chevrolet Lumina, he and his friends would attend two separate gatherings, one in Lind and another one in Canby near his school, where they would all spend a large portion of the night. After a night of laughing, celebrating, and a little bit of drinking, Brandon had enough, and around midnight decided to make his way home so that he could finally rest after a long first year of his studies. 12 a.m. Shortly after midnight, Brandon would step into his green Chevy Lumina and get onto Highway 68 and start making his way back home. Brandon had taken this route many times between his campus and home. Highway 68 directly connected the towns of Marshall and Canby, and the drive was quite straightforward. But for some reason, on this night, Brandon wouldn't take the straight path home, and instead, he decided to veer off the highway and start taking some gravel roads near the town of Taunton. Perhaps he made the wrong turn, or perhaps he was afraid that there might be police performing checks on the highway, and Brandon, who had consumed a little alcohol, was afraid of being caught. Regardless, he would find himself in a dark and rural part of the county. 1:54 a.m. Eventually, due to a combination of the alcohol, darkness, and legal blindness in his left eye, he would accidentally go off the road and crash into a ditch. Uninjured, he would stumble out of his car and take a look at his surroundings. Seeing the lights in the distance, he believed that he was near Lind. Lind is southwest of Marshall, while Canby is northwest. This means that Brandon believed that he supposedly overshot Marshall by 11 kilometers. Somehow, Brandon got lost on the back roads and ended up making a wrong turn and passing Marshall altogether, at least according to Brandon himself. Alone and trapped, he called his parents and requested that they pick him up. Unsure of exactly where he was, he would mention that he was around Lind and try to describe his location as best as he could. However, his parents would be unable to locate him, despite Brandon trying to get their attention by flashing his lights. Brandon's father would recount hearing the clicking of the lights, and as his son was trying in vain hope to get his parents' attention so that they would see the lights and find him. 2:30 a.m. After being frustrated, Brandon would end the conversation by telling his dad to just meet him in what Brandon believed was Lind. Brandon would cut across the field and pass over fences, and would mention that he heard the sound of running water nearby. On his way there, Brandon would yell, "Oh shit," and fall off the face of the earth. Complete silence. Despite the attempts of his parents to call him back, these words were the last anyone would ever hear of Brandon. After waiting for Brandon and Lind and failing to get a hold of him, his parents would return home and leave their porch light on, hoping that it might help Brandon find his way home. 6:30 a.m. 4 hours after speaking with Brandon, his parents had not seen or heard from him since. Getting more worried by the second, they would finally call the Lind Police Department and report Brandon as missing. Unfortunately, the police wouldn't share their worry. They would be told that the behavior was normal for boys that were Brandon's age, and his mother Annette would report that one of the officers told her that Brandon had a right to be missing. They told the worried parents to wait a little, and that Brandon would most likely be still with his friends celebrating, or perhaps had passed out after a heavy night of drinking at someone's house. Of course, this did little to alleviate the worries of the Swanson family. Brandon was clearly in trouble and had crashed his car in the middle of some farms on the outskirts of Lind. It was mid-spring, and the temperatures could still get quite cold. Not wanting to wait any longer, they would press the police. Eventually, the police would begin their search later in the morning, but they wouldn't find Brandon and Lind or the local area. Even Brandon's trapped car wasn't found either. The police would acquire the cell phone records for Brandon and find out that he had been calling his parents not from Lind, but instead from around the town of Taunton, almost 40 kilometers north of Lind. It seems that Brandon didn't overshoot Marshall as he believed, but instead had only made it 20 kilometers out of Canby and wasn't even halfway to Marshall. For some reason, just outside of Canby, Brandon had decided to make a detour east and leave Highway 68 and not take the regular and straightforward route. Also, for some reason, 1 hour and 54 minutes had passed between him leaving Canby and calling his parents. We don't know exactly what Brandon did in that time. Due to this new information, the police would move their search efforts north and eventually discover Brandon's car in the 3900 block of Leon Lincoln Road. The car itself is the only thing the police would find at this location. Brandon's clothes, phone, and keys were missing. The car itself wasn't damaged, and there didn't seem to be any sign of foul play. The car was hung up on the top of an incline with the wheels sticking up, unable to contact the ground below. This is exactly why Brandon couldn't drive his car out of there. Not finding Brandon near the scene of the crash, the police would at this point begin the largest manhunt the local area had ever seen. With 500 volunteers and 34 dog handlers from 9 different states, they would begin to sweep the local counties for Brandon. Aerial flyovers would be performed and even bloodhounds would join the hunt. Unfortunately, the search would prove difficult. Brandon for some reason had decided to venture into the backcountry where it was all grass and gravel. This meant that there weren't any good footprints that the police could use to begin their search. During his call with his father, Brandon had mentioned seeing a red light in the distance. It is believed that this red light was from a local grain elevator in Taunton. This red light might have been what led Brandon to believe that Lind was within walking distance. The bloodhounds would pick up the scent and trace it into the fields up to an abandoned farm. Afterwards, the bloodhounds would lead them directly to the nearby Yellow Medicine River. Unfortunately, the dogs would eventually lose the scent. The police would search the Yellow Medicine River, but wouldn't be able to find any traces of Brandon. The police would search the local fields, hoping to find some signs of him, and at least some remains so the family could get some closure. But some farmers would refuse to allow the police to search their property, leading to there being large gaps in the search area. As Brandon had mentioned hearing running water nearby, one of the popular suspicions was that he had fallen into the river and drowned. Boats from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources would be deployed in the river to find Brandon, but again, nothing would be found. After an extensive search, resources would eventually be reduced. The local sheriff, John Vijeski, would continue to walk the Yellow Medicine River in hopes of discovering something, but eventually even he would give up. But despite the efforts of the local and state officials, Brandon had completely disappeared, and no one had any evidence to show where he could possibly be. The sudden disappearance of Brandon Swanson would rock the local community. The most perplexing part of the disappearance was that nothing besides his car would ever be found. His phone, clothes, nor the keys would ever surface. Law enforcement has continued to receive many different tips about Brandon. However, none of these tips have ever led to anything solid, and local farmers in the area have still refused to allow their fields to be searched, fearful that any search attempts would hurt their crops and overall hurt their livelihoods. The Swanson family, even after all these years, still seems very hopeful. In fact, each evening they still leave their porch light on, hoping that somehow it would help their son find his way back home. "There's no reason to turn it off now," Brandon Swanson said. "I'm pretty sure we're not going to find him alive, but I still want to believe that we will find him. That's probably a stretch, but I want to believe that." So the biggest question is, what exactly happened to Brandon Swanson? Why did he leave Highway 68 and go into these rural gravel roads that he's never really used before? Also, why would Brandon think that he was in Lind, when in reality he was still quite near Canby? There are people out there that think that foul play may have played a role in this. So witnesses have recounted that before Brandon left that he had apparently got into arguments with some people. But again, like I said before, no evidence of foul play has ever been discovered. However, if these witnesses are correct, it could be possible that these people that he got into an argument with could have potentially kidnapped Brandon and driven him out to a rural area. Perhaps during this whole event, Brandon fought back, and that's what led the car to crashing into the ditch. Perhaps Brandon, while he was being kidnapped, didn't see where he was going and didn't have a good idea of the area, and that's why he mistakenly believed that he was in Lind after he saw the lights in the distance. And the reason why his body was never found is because the kidnappers might have taken him and hidden the body somewhere, perhaps somewhere on a farmer's property. A farmer who, coincidentally, might have refused the local police to search his land. However, like I said before, no evidence of foul play has ever been found, so this theory is probably the most unlikely. Some people have even believed that maybe Brandon staged his disappearance. He told his parents that he was in Lind to get them and potentially the police off his trail, at least long enough for him to plan his escape and get out of there. But his family and friends have denied these allegations, saying that there was really no indications or any issues that he had with his family that would cause him to do this. Another theory has been that Brandon might have been killed by a local farmer. Perhaps the farmer mistook him for some sort of a trespasser that wanted to steal something. The farmer shot him, and after seeing that it was just an unarmed kid, he might have gotten afraid of being arrested and put in prison, so instead he hid the body and hid it from the police. It's also possible that maybe Brandon did fall into the river but managed to get out, but later on died because of the hypothermia, eventually falling in some sort of a farmer's field. And later on, his body could have been destroyed by farm equipment, where a farmer may have accidentally killed him while plowing or harvesting his fields. My theory is that Brandon went off the road because he was intoxicated and was afraid that the police might be performing sobriety tests on the main highway. Then once on the rural roads, Brandon got lost due to being unfamiliar with the area. This, combined with his intoxication, poor visibility and eyesight, led him to accidentally crash into a ditch. He believed he was near Lind, perhaps as he might have been driving in circles and lost track of time. The lights in the distance might have looked familiar to Lind, again due to poor visibility and eyesight. This is probably why almost 2 hours passed between him leaving Canby and him calling his parents. It is also possible that he tried to free the car for a while before eventually calling his parents. After getting frustrated with his parents not finding him, he ventured southwards towards the light he had seen, and perhaps accidentally fell into the river. Again, he did yell "oh shit" before he cut out, and there was nothing but silence. This could have been due to him falling into something like a river. The phone would have obviously gone into the river and eventually turned off due to the water damage. Also, due to the spring snow melt, it's possible that the river may have been much colder than usual, and also would have definitely been much higher and much more powerful, and this would have quickly dragged him away. Then, hypothermia or drowning would have killed him, and his body would have been lost to the forces of nature. Again, this is just a theory, and unfortunately, Brandon left behind very little evidence to give us any sort of a clear indication of what could have happened to him. His friends and father have claimed that on the night of disappearance, Brandon wasn't really drunk. He was actually quite coherent and didn't seem all that confused or dizzy. Of course, this could just be his friends and family trying to make Brandon look better. For all we know, he could have simply just disappeared into thin air, just some bad circumstances. All we know is that Brandon left Canby alone at midnight. He planned to go straight home to Marshall on Highway 68, but for some reason, he decided to pull off the highway near Taunton. He ended up taking the dark and isolated gravel roads of the country, but somehow crashed into a ditch. Not being able to free his car, he called his parents and mistakenly or purposely told his parents that he was in Lind. Brandon may have zoned out while he was driving, and thereby would have been a little bit confused of where he was, and might have legitimately believed that he was in Lind. Due to this incorrect information, his parents would never arrive, and would instead wait for him in Lind. But Brandon never came. Something happened to Brandon, something that we might never know. To this day, Brandon, and any sign of what happened to him, has never been found. What was supposed to be a night of celebration and a rite of passage became a night of sorrow and mystery. Brandon left Canby to head home, but for some reason, he decided to take another path. Though Brandon himself is gone, his legacy remains. After this disappearance, his parents would lobby the Minnesota government to pass Brandon's law, which would require the police to immediately begin investigating the disappearance of everyone up to the age of 21. This would ensure that victims, especially young ones, can be more easily located. There are still countless questions and countless unknowns. To this day, people and the police are still trying to piece together of what could have possibly happened. Though Brandon is gone, his legacy lives on, as none of us can ever forget.
Nancy Grace, every night at 8 Eastern.
HLN News and Views.
Annette Swanson is joining us. She is the mother of Brandon Swanson, joining us from Minnesota. Thank you so much for joining us from Marshall, Minnesota, actually. First of all, I want to ask you, Ms. Swanson, you were on the phone with your son a large part of those early hours when you were trying to find him, and he was trying to find you. He wasn't hurt at all, right? I mean, the car went into a ditch, but he seemed to be okay.
Correct. He said he was fine, that he was not injured. And, you know, in fact, when we did find his vehicle, there was no damage to it. It was simply muddy from being on a gravel road, but no damage to the vehicle.
What was it like that night to be going through this and so close to your son, but so far from your son?
Yeah, you know, as you know, as Brandon tried to explain to us where his location was, and he was extremely sure of himself. He felt confident in where he was at, and that we were the ones that were confused about, you know, how to get to him. And as the conversation went on, as the minutes ticked by, you know, it came to a point where as long as Brandon was on the phone, as long as he was talking, as long as we had contact, it was okay. We would be okay. But the minute that that call dropped, I just became sick. I knew it was wrong. I knew it was very, very bad. And just could hardly fathom, you know, what was happening at that point.
Well, I can imagine. I mean, to take a breath. Now, when the call just hung up like that with Brandon in dire distress, I mean, those were the words that he seemed to utter when he said, "Oh." Did you try to call him after that, and what happened?
Oh, yes, we did. You know, we didn't immediately hang up the phone. We called his name. We tried to, you know, thinking that he still had the phone, that it was very near him, that he could pick it up. He'd hear our voice, and we called out to him several times, and we realized, you know, he's not there. So we did. We called him back several times, thinking, you know, he'll see the phone light up. Even if he didn't have it on ring, he would see his phone light up when the call came in, and he'd find it. You know, he'd answer the call, and it just didn't happen. Time and again, it just went unanswered.
What time did you finally call police?
I finally called the sheriff's department at approximately 6:30 in the morning.
So right when the sun was coming up.